Thank you very much, Bill, for your kind invitation. Don't know about the 97, maybe it was supposed to be 79, but we can work that out later. But anyways, again, thank you very much for your kind invitation and generous hospitality here. I hope my brief remarks on the topic of Thomas and natural law, which deals with virtue and friendship, will be worthy of your attention, at least beneficial in some way. So it might seem then. Oh, one last thing.
One last thing, on your table, you'll see index cards and pencils. So after Dr. Salas's lecture, we're going to have cake and coffee, and we're going to have a question and answer period. So if you think of something you want to ask him, please use the paper and pencil in front of you.
Great, thank you. So before he jumps in again, we'll get right into it, right? So at first, it might seem somewhat implausible that we should turn to a medieval thinker like Thomas Aquinas, and you can say even a very medieval notion of natural law, to gain any kind of insight into the way things are or ought to be in our contemporary situation. And what might we describe our contemporary situation is, I think we can use this term, perhaps we've heard of it before, postmodernism, right? So we're very much in a postmodern epoch in which there is a kind of embrace of reason in terms of it's just being reduced to localities, as opposed to making any kind of global statements of this is the way things are, this is the way things ought to be, right? We live then in this postmodern epoch in which we are free to determine ourselves as we see fit, right? I am fundamentally free, and we hear about this all the time, the claims of we are free people, but the question here is this, and what do we mean exactly by freedom? Well, anyone who's ever had a child, I have 4 of them, especially, and a number of them are teenagers now. Freedom is just this, license, right? Quite literally a license to drive, but just a license to do anything I want. And so if you tell me I can't do X, Y, or Z, even though maybe I don't even want to do X, Y, or Z, right? This is a kind of impediment and offense to me insofar as you're retaliating against me, taking away my freedom. So we live in an age, a postmodern epoch, in which we value freedom as this ability to get what we want, whatever we want, however we want, right? And so the idea then that we should turn to this medieval thinker, Thomas Aquinas in particular, with this notion of a natural law seems perhaps a bit implausible in light of our contemporary situation. But I would suggest that perhaps actually Thomas in particular and this notion of the natural law has a great deal to recommend to us in terms of just making sense of our moral lives, our actions, society, so on and so forth. So I was tasked with giving the discussion today about natural law. So the question is, what do we mean by this? What do we mean, on the one hand, by natural? And then how do we apply this to the law? And we can think about this. Well, look at both terms, nature, natural, and the law. And so what do we mean by nature? Well, as Bill suggested to you earlier, Thomas Aquinas is an Aristotelian, okay? And what does that mean? Well, it means and implies a number of things. What important to Aristotle was this notion of a nature, okay? When you look at the term nature, it derives from the Latin term natura. And natura itself derives from the Latin term nascere, the verb to be born, okay? The Greek equivalent of this is physics, or physis, which you heard from the term physics. And physis likewise comes from the verb phuein, which again is to grow or to be born. So here's the thing that we can look at. When we're talking about natural things, we're talking about things that are organic, that develop unto themselves as distinct from something like an artifact, okay? So here we are at the beginning of spring, so it seems, right? And we see a variety of things coming into new being, coming into life. Plants beginning to bloom, weeds, of course, always growing in my lawn, little ducks, little bunnies, so on and so forth. We see new life. And here's the thing about nature, that you see that it wells up from within itself. Okay, so I don't know if you've ever had this experience where you find an egg. Right? I actually encountered this once, right? You just go out into the woods and you find an egg there. And the question then is, well, what kind of egg is this? Does this belong to a certain kind of bird? Perhaps it's even a lizard, maybe, I don't know, something else, right? So the question is, how do you determine what kind of an entity this is? Now, perhaps you're a biologist or a zoologist and you're familiar with various kinds of eggs. And yeah, I know exactly what kind of egg this is, but perhaps you're not. And the way in which you would make the determination of what kind of entity this is would be to take it and do what with it? Well, ultimately watch it hatch. And so here's this kind of dynamic activity. This thing is growing, right? It's marching towards some kind of end, shall we say, okay? There is a certain kind of activity, and this activity reveals the nature of the thing at hand, okay? You're not surprised, for instance, when you see a tree swaying in the wind, right? You're not surprised when you see trees bud new leaves, when you see flowers bloom, so on and so forth. You're not surprised when perhaps your neighbor's dog barks at you, okay? But you would, however, be surprised if when you went to collect the mail, the neighbor's dog, instead of barking at you, engaged you in some kind of political discourse, perhaps on Viennese economics or something like that, right? So that's not, you would be amazed, right? You wouldn't be surprised to go into your house and find your daughter playing the violin or your son playing the piano. You would be surprised to find your dog or cat playing the piano, okay, or writing some kind of poetry, right? That's not the kind of a thing that an animal does. So the point is when you look at nature, natural things, natural beings, first of all, they exercise a kind of activity. And that activity is commensurate with the kind of thing that they are, okay? They grow then, they reach a certain kind of maturity. Now, here's the question we have to ask ourselves is when you look at this activity, to what is it directed? Now, imagine this, you come into this building, you find Bill just standing on one leg. Okay, this might attract your attention, and obviously you would wonder what are you doing, right? Maybe he's trying to, I don't know, take some kind of field sobriety test or get some kind of exercise or just see how long he can hop on one leg. But if you're asking him, what are you doing? And he simply says this, I'm just standing on my leg. Well, it's obvious. Why are you doing this? If he just says, just because, that's unintelligible, right? Why are you carrying out this kind of activity? And so the point is this, that Thomas, and here following Aristotle, he sees this, that activity is always directed towards some kind of end, okay? Now, perhaps you've heard this term before, telos, right, or teleology, that all of our actions are directed at some kind of end, okay? Before you go to bed at night, what do? Perhaps you set your alarm, right? What's the goal? What's the purpose for setting your alarm? Well, obviously, so that the alarm will go off at the designated time in the morning, okay? That's the intelligible characteristic of this activity. So the point that Thomas Aquinas makes is this, there is a kind of intelligible structure in the order of nature, right? Nature is that which acts, and it acts for the sake of some kind of end. And now the question is going to be this, what is that end? Okay, what's the end to which all things are directed? Now, when you look at the natural world, shall we say, again, as I mentioned, now we're kind of in the midst of spring, and you see a variety of new life. You see little bunnies, you see fawns, you see little ducklings, little goslings, and you might ask yourself, what are they constantly trying to do? What's their point? The point for them is one of maturity, right? A fawn will follow its mother, attain nourishment, grow, so on and so forth, until eventually it attains a point of maturity where it too can multiply, propagate, okay? So the question then becomes this, well, what is the end to which we as humans are directed? Now, what Thomas is going to say is this, there's a huge difference between just the natural world, that is to say, the world of plants and animals, and the world as it pertains to human beings. Because when we can act to fulfill our nature, right? We can act to realize our nature, but that action falls within the scope of our own power. Okay, so what do I mean by this? Well, if you take an acorn, for instance, and you place it in the soil, and assuming that there is no impediment, assuming that the conditions are correct, what's eventually going to happen to this acorn? It will send down a root, send up a shoot, and become an oak tree, right? That's what it's going to be. It's going to realize its nature that way. When you look at a baby bunny, a little rabbit, what is it going to do? Well, if you give it the proper food, nourishment, the proper habitat, this animal will eventually do what? Attain maturity, perhaps find a mate, okay, propagate, so on and so forth. So what Thomas is saying is when you look at the natural world, it seems as though all of these various entities, by their own nature, act for the sake of nature, okay? But humans are, well, we can differ. We're distinct from that. That is to say, I act with intellect and will. Okay, so when you look at my actions, what kind of a nature do I have? Well, Thomas and Aristotle would say, I have the nature of being a rational animal. Okay, and so how can I act then? I act, of course, when I sneeze or cough, I act just as a kind of animal, but more fundamentally, I act in terms of intellect and will. So think of this, there's a nice cake over there, for some reason it has my name on it, right? And so as we know, cakes are probably high in calories, okay? Is it good for you? Well, perhaps if you have if you burn a lot of calories a day, it's not a big deal. But, let's say your physician has asked you to cut back on your calories, and there you walk up to the cake. Are you tempted to consume it? Perhaps so, right? If it has your name on it, you're obliged to eat it, right? And so